Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we discussed in the last part of this series, Muslims in China have a long and detailed history that began shortly after the Rashidun conquest of Persia in the mid-7th century. After a rocky start and a few military encounters that began with the Umayyad Caliphate and carried on into the early years of the Abbasids with the decisive Battle of Talas, relations eventually stabilized. The two civilizations quickly became entwined through trade, both in the west through the land routes of the Silk Road in Central Asia, and in the east through its maritime routes in the South China Sea. This would spark the beginning of a massive cultural, scientific, and technological exchange that would remain consistent for the better part of a millennia until the rise of the Mongols under Temujin, better known by his honorary title Genghis Khan, meaning ruler of the universe. The expansion of the Mongol Empire would change the course of this exchange forever and completely revolutionize the role of Muslims in Chinese society. Genghis Khan's rise to power was rapid and deadly. He would officially enter China in 1209 AD with his subjugation of Western Xia, but that would only be the beginning. In 1211, he would invade the Yuan Dynasty, who had wrested northern China from Song nearly a century earlier. This war was a success, aided by defections and an untimely coup in the Jin capital of Zhongdu. Following his initial victory and the signing of a peace treaty between the two states, which involved a lot of gold going to the Mongols, the Jin emperor would move his capital to Kaifeng, which Genghis Khan took as a violation of the treaty, and so recommenced his invasion, this time sacking the old capital of Zhongdu for all it was worth. Genghis used the gold he had won in these wars to revamp the Mongol capital of Karakoram. He imported many Muslim artisans to aid in this, who would go on to settle within their own quarter of the city, complete with 2 mosques. Genghis had firmly established Mongol influence in China, which would only continue to grow under the leadership of his successors. Of course, Temujin expanded towards the west as well, where many more Muslims resided and were killed, such as in Nishapur, which had its entire population of nearly 200,000 people massacred. But that could make a series of its own, and I don't want to go into too much detail on the Mongols outside of China. By 1234 AD, the rest of the Jin dynasty had fallen under Mongol control at the hands of Ogedai Khan, with help from the Song Dynasty in the south. By the time of the brutal sacking of Baghdad in 1258, the Mongols controlled all of China, save for the rump state of the Song Dynasty, their former allies which they had betrayed and invaded once already. Their remaining holdings were almost completely surrounded by Mongol-occupied territory on all sides. In 1260, coinciding with the death of Manka Khan, the Mongols would finally display their invincibility in the west, with the Battle of Ain Jalut against the Mamluks, a decisive loss, and the Mongol Empire would shortly after split into 4 different essentially independent states, leaving Kublai Khan, who consolidated power in the east, ruling the rest of his empire only nominally. Kublai Khan's territory would develop into the Sinicized Yuan Dynasty, which is where Muslims really begin to enter the picture once again. With such a large, diverse population to draw from, Kublai Khan would start importing tens of thousands of craftsmen, artisans, physicians, technicians, and even administrators and diplomats from the west, most of whom were Muslim. This had been happening in the Mongol Empire on a smaller scale before the establishment of the Yuan, as I mentioned earlier, with the development of Karakoram, but this massive relocation of experts would reach new heights under Kublai's reign. The largest influx of Muslims into China in its history can be seen around this time, with communities finally growing outside of the northwest and southeast into all 4 corners of the region. Many historical records such as the Yuan Shi list thousands of officials, military officers, physicians, etc. with Muslim names, although these Muslims would not yet be integrated into Chinese society, and we will see exactly why that was. Kublai organized the population of his empire into 4 classes. At the top were the Mongols, of course, followed by the Semoren, which included Muslims, then the Hanren, North Chinese, and finally the Nanren, South Chinese. Yes, Muslims were second in rank only to the Mongols themselves, above the native Chinese populations. Within this class system, Mongols and the Samuran were granted special privileges such as exemption from taxation, which prompted many Muslims to settle in China. For example, in Hainan, there was reported a community of 186 Muslim households farming land that was given to them by the Yuan court. Marco Polo writes about the consequences of this imposed hierarchy, saying, quote, "The Chinese hated the rule of the Great Khan because he set over them Tartar and for the more part Saracen rulers." Marco Polo despised Muslims and Islam and can't be trusted as an impartial source, but this observation gives us insight on the significance of Muslims under the Yuan Dynasty. Because of their roles as tax collectors and merchants, they were often the targets of Chinese animosity, and their contributions to Chinese science and technology before the Mongol invasions were forgotten. During this period, Muslims generally lived in separate, self-governed communities, which similarly did not help their image with the general Chinese public. They were useful scapegoats for the Mongols, whether they were intended to be or not. That's not to say that Muslims were innocent victims here. Many used their privileged status against the Chinese for their own gains. Many were dealing with interest, for example, which is of course forbidden in Islam. One such Muslim was Ahmed Bana Keti, unfortunately infamous for his exploitation of the Chinese natives. He is credited with the formulation of the Yuan's entire taxation system and was mentioned by Marco Polo as immensely wealthy. He was assassinated in 1281 by two Han Chinese vigilantes. Kublai was apparently unaware of Ahmed's corrupt policies, and when he found out following his death, he would posthumously punish him by executing all of his sons, which were numbered by Marco Polo to be around 25. When it came to religion, the Mongols were pragmatists. It is true that the Mongols were religiously tolerant, however not in the modern liberal sense of the term, which is often applied anachronistically. They were tolerant for the time. Kublai would, on multiple occasions, pass edicts that restricted Islamic practices such as circumcision and halal slaughter, although these were temporary and probably could have been much worse. Kublai, in fact, was an admitted syncretist, and in fact, Marco Polo, who was close with the Khan, quoted him as saying, quote, "There are 4 prophets who are worshipped and to whom everybody does reverence. The Christians say their God was Jesus Christ, the Saracens Mahomet, the Jews Moses, and the Buddhists the Buddha. I do honor and reverence to all 4. A bit confused when it comes to practice and creed, but his main concern was keeping a cosmopolitan empire together. We know that the Great Khan's council was extremely diverse, which included Persian, Arab, Chinese, and Mongol advisors primarily. Kublai sought the help of Muslims when it came to the basics of agricultural society, which had been foreign to the Mongols until recently, as well as the arts and sciences. Muslims were renowned for their advancements in medicine, and their physicians were prized from the west in Al-Andalus to the east in China. Kublai regarded them most highly, filling his imperial hospital with the best physicians from the Muslim world to treat his family and court. The nature of the cultural scientific exchange between the Chinese and the Muslims would quickly become more one-sided under the Yuan. Muslim cultural elements such as their music, medicine, and food would begin spreading rapidly within China as migration increased. Before the Mongol invasions, this exchange permeated primarily through the northwestern land border and southeastern maritime border, whereas under the Yuan, the exchange was occurring mostly from within, caused mostly by stationary Muslim settlers, and not by itinerant merchants. That does not mean, however, that Chinese cultural facets and technology did not spread past its borders. It's around this time that Muslims began circulating playing cards, seals, and stamps, which all originated in China. We know that there were many Muslims governing for Kublai during his reign. The Persian historian Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani, who served as wazir under the Ilkhanid Sultan Ghazan, writes that at one point Muslims were governing 8 out of the 12 administrative districts within the Yuan Empire. One of these governors we know a bit more about was Sayyid Ajal Shamsuddin Umar al-Bukhari, appointed governor of Yunnan in 1274, just before Kublai would invade Song. As his name suggests, he originated from Bukhara, although he traced his lineage back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was formerly a logistician in Manka Khan's army and also a finance minister for a while. During his governorship, he commissioned religious buildings for a plethora of faiths within the province, including 2 mosques. He was succeeded as governor by his son, Nasr ad-Din. The Song would champion themselves as the defenders of the Chinese natives and attempt to stand against Kublai, but this was futile. and all of Song, including its rebellious loyalists, would succumb by 1279 AD, and its territory would be completely annexed by Yuan. Muslim defectors from Song to Yuan would play a large role in the success of Kublai during this campaign, specifically one Pu Shougang, who offered the Mongols an entire navy, a department that they were notoriously lacking in. During all of this, the Muslims in Guangzhou remained the strongest mercantile force in the region, being South China, and this position would not be altered as the city changed hands. Another port city taken from Song, which had cultivated a large foreign Muslim population and developed similarly to Guangzhou, was Chenzhou, known in Arabic as Medinat az-Zaytun, the city of the olives. Here, just like Guangzhou, we see an example of the self-governed communities I mentioned earlier, and a large one at that. There was an official title called Sheikh al-Islam, not to be confused with the honorary title, and he would act as the spiritual leader and also political contact between the Muslims of the city and the Mongol government. There was also a qadi, or Islamic judge, who applied the Sharia. Arabic and Persian were widely spoken, and learning Chinese was not compulsory. Another such center for Muslim traders was Hangzhou, which was one of, if not the most populous city in the world at the time. It was described by Marco Polo as, quote, beyond dispute the finest and noblest city in the world. It was also home to a flourishing Muslim quarter, much like Chenzhou. It seems the Muslims within these quarters applied Sharia without much interference from the Mongols. Even later on, when Islamic practice was more heavily restricted, they seem to have been left alone. All over the southeastern coast of China, Muslims continued to hold important governmental positions in finance under Yuan as they had throughout the Tang and Song eras before. With the significant Muslim presence in the region at this time and the dominance that they held over trade in the South China Sea, Islam began spreading rapidly in Malacca and the East Indies, which is why countries like Malaysia and Indonesia are majority Muslim today. Near the end of Kublai's reign and continuing after it, policies would be enacted that slowly wrested power from the hands of Muslims by the advice of non-Muslim Yuan courtiers, specifically the native Chinese, as the Yuan rulers became more and more Sinicized. Although the roles of the Muslims under the Yuan dynasty would change over time, their influence persisted, and their numbers, which had increased so rapidly under Kublai, would not dwindle. In fact, they would only increase, with migration not being the sole contributing factor. Rashid ad-Din, whom I mentioned earlier, writes of a mass conversion to Islam in western Xia, spearheaded by its governor Ananda, originally a Buddhist, the grandson of Kublai Khan. Rashid ad-Din writes that over 150,000 Mongol troops were subordinate to him, and that most followed their leader and became Muslim, along with many of the native inhabitants. Rashid ad-Din mentions that there were, quote, 24 large towns in that kingdom, and most of the inhabitants were Muslims. Ibn Battuta was a Moroccan Muslim traveler who went all over the known world and recorded his travels. During his stay in Delhi, he was appointed Qadi by Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, a position which he kept for 6 years until 1341, when the Sultan asked him to go to China and meet with its emperor as an ambassador. He landed in the port city of Chenzhou, or Medinat az-Zaytun, in 1345, during the very last years of the Yuan Dynasty's rule over China. Note that this was after many of the Muslims' special privileges had been revoked, and their time as high-ranking ministers and advisors had long passed. Ibn Battuta's famous work is Ar-Rihla, in which he narrates his journey throughout the world. Here's what he wrote about his time in China. Quote, in every Chinese city there is a quarter for Muslims in which they live by themselves, and in which they have mosques both for the Friday services and for other religious purposes. The Muslims are honored and respected. In Chenzhou, the Muslims live in a quarter apart from the others. I received visits from the Qadi of the Muslims, the Sheikh al-Islam, and the principal merchants." End quote. In Chenzhou, he met the head of Muslim merchants in the city, who welcomed him with what was essentially a parade, featuring a band of musicians and even flag bearers. During his time in and around the city, he climbed the Mount of the Hermit and visited a Taoist monk there, although his opinion on the religions of the natives was not particularly high. Quote, "The Chinese themselves are infidels who worship idols and burn their dead like the Hindus. They eat the flesh of swine and dogs and sell it in their markets." After this, Ibn Battuta would travel to Guangzhou, where he stayed for 2 weeks. Quote, "In one of the quarters of Guangzhou is the Muslim town, where the Muslims have a cathedral mosque, hospital, and bazaar. They also have a qadi and a sheikh, for in every one of the cities of China there must be a sheikh al-Islam, to whom all matters concerning the Muslims are referred, and a qadi to decide legal cases between them." End quote. We can see that these Muslim communities endured over time and were allowed to continue practicing and applying religious law just as they were under Kublai. Ibn Battuta would then go to Hangzhou, where he stayed with a family of Egyptians. He comments on the size of the city, saying it was one of the biggest he had seen on his travels, and gives mention to the beauty of West Lake, which the city was built around. Quote, "Hangzhou consists of 6 quarters. We entered the second quarter through a gate called the Jews' Gate. In this quarter lived the Jews, Christians, and sun-worshipping Turks, a large number in all. Its governor is Chinese. The third quarter is inhabited by the Muslims. Theirs is a fine quarter, and their bazaars are arranged just as they are in Islamic countries. They have mosques and mueddins." End quote. A clear distinction was made here between the foreign quarter and the Muslim quarter, demonstrating the unique status that Muslims held in China, even much after the reign of Kublai. Lastly, he would go to the capital, Beijing, called Khanbaliq at the time, which literally means city of the Khan. He describes how he felt traveling in China during his time there. Quote, "China is the safest and most agreeable country in the world for the traveler. You can travel all alone across the land for 9 months without fear, even if you are carrying much wealth." When he arrived in the city, he was invited as a guest of honor to the Emperor Huizong's palace. However, he was disappointed to find out that he was absent from the capital. He left the gifts nonetheless and began his journey back to Zhengzhou. Ibn Battuta had heard that the wall of Dhul Qarnayn, built to defend against Gog and Magog, was somewhere in China and mentioned it in his writings. He was probably, obviously, referring to the Great Wall of China, which he did not get to visit himself. On his return from China, he wrote, quote, "China was beautiful, but it did not please me. On the contrary, I was greatly troubled thinking about the way paganism dominated this country. Whenever I went out of my lodging, I saw many blameworthy things. That disturbed me so much that I stayed indoors most of the time and only went out when necessary. During my stay in China, whenever I saw any Muslims, I always felt as though I were meeting my own family and close kinsmen." End quote. Overall, Ibn Battuta's journey gives us a decent perspective of what Yuan was like for Muslims in its later stages, long after the zenith of Muslim influence within the country. After his 30-year-long journey, Ibn Battuta would eventually return to Tanja, the place of his birth, where he would die at the age of 65. In the next part of this series, I will cover the fall of the Yuan Dynasty and the rise of Ming in its place, and what roles the Muslims played during this new era of Chinese history. Liking and subscribing always helps, of course. Thanks for watching and take care. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم.